on all the Great Plains, reaching like a thumb down from Canada deep into the country of the Rio Grande. The one enduring figure has been the man who works with cattle. He came with the first Spanish cows, saw them multiply thick as the buffaloes on the prairie. He watched the Stone Age Indian turn into a mounted rifleman, the hide hunters sweep the buffalo away, and the starving Indians finally depart for the reservations. He had to see the newly freed range vanish before the homesteader, perhaps permanently, at least to be paid for in hard cash. Maurice Sandoz, 1958. The American West, and ultimately the American nation, was built upon the backs of hard-working men and women. These were people who risked everything in search of the promise of better times ahead. They were visionary, they were optimistic, entrepreneurial risk-takers. Many left established homes and successful businesses back east and risked everything in search of something more beyond the next hill. Others had nothing to lose and went strictly on the promise of better times. Now, America needed those people, men, women, all ethnicities, all religions, all backgrounds, all kinds of people. America needed their courage, optimism, vision, perseverance, bone, muscle, sweat, and intellect. But America needed something else to grow into what it eventually became. It needed blood and leather. Welcome to episode 1 of the Blood and Leather podcast. So hello to all of you out there. I'm Tim Carter. I'm the creator and host of the Blood and Leather podcast. It is my pleasure to be here with you for episode 1. This is an undertaking that I put together in my mind a while back and have wanted to follow up on for quite some time. This podcast is intended to be a review of history from my perspective. It's primarily American history, the history of the American continent, and it'll go back in time to way before the United States was a nation. I'm sure that we'll talk about a lot of other related people, events, and places from time to time, and we may even examine pioneers in other areas from time to time. But I want this podcast to be conversational. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to put notes together, I'm going to think about connections, and I'm going to just talk to you as I would with a close friend. To me, this approach suits me best. I enjoy listening to people who are sharing real thoughts with each other, unscripted, and sort of just creating a wonderful conversation among friends. I put this podcast together in my mind, as I said, quite some time ago, and I realized for episode 1 that there had to be a launch point that was strong enough to get us off to a good start. And I wanted to come out of the gate fast, as they say. But how to do that? To me, no other topic could carry as much weight when it comes to the American West as that of the evolution of the American cowboy. So we'll talk a lot about that here in episode 1. To really do this topic justice would take a long time, and I expect that we'll be visiting and revisiting this topic frequently over time. But I think that to get us off on the right foot, we will start with 1 hour of thought and reflection on the evolution of the myth and the reality of the American cowboy. That'll help get us cranked up. You'll get to know me, and we can revisit the topic, and we will periodically as we go through other topics that are of interest to me. First thing that I want to do, though, is to kind of give a bit of a background on the whole concept, because to me, when we hear the term cowboy, our minds instantly see the mythical image of that character. And for much of the world, I think America, at least one of the iconic images of America would be that of the cowboy. In fact, a 2017 study in the UK revealed that 19% of Britons who responded to that study chose the cowboy hat as the object most associated with Americans. Now, that percentage was lower than those who thought a baseball cap or the Stars and Stripes were the most associated with America. But still, as a card-carrying baseball cap wearer, I'm cool with this. Nevertheless, if the cowboy hat is thought of by upwards of 20% of Britons as the iconic image of the United States, then that means it's a it's a fairly widespread image of what America might be. Perhaps less now than at the height of the cowboy craze back in the 1950s and 60s. Americans associate several different traits with the hero that we're talking about here. I think honesty, strength, courage, rugged good looks, loyalty, wisdom, each of those represents how we might view the cowboy. We could toss in tough, capable. Those are terms that we might also attribute to the cowboy. Now, the question is, how much of this is hyperbole and how much of this is fact? I suppose to get things started, I really want to introduce you not only to the concept of the cowboy, but also to myself. Episode 1 should be the launch point for getting to know something about me. And so by the beginning, I mean my beginning. I need to explain sort of where I'm coming from as a creator of this podcast. I am and have always been an amateur historian. And I love stories, I love history. And in fact, history is nothing but one long, unending story, at least so far. So everything is in some fashion related to everything else. I've always loved reading. I've always loved learning about other people, and I've often lived vicariously through those writings. I've enjoyed so many times finding an author and falling in love with that author. I remember as a kid finding in my school library Jim Kelgard's books, and you might remember Big Red as a book that Jim Kelgard wrote. Eventually made into a Disney movie. In those books, Jim Kelgard wrote for young people, but he wrote of things that were adult: action, suspense, a lot about animals as well. And so my perception of the world, I would say, was filtered through Jim Kelgard for many years early in my life. A bit later, I discovered a fellow named Louis L'Amour, and of course anybody who's interested in anything Western has heard Louis L'Amour's name. But when I found Louis L'Amour, I began a lifelong appreciation for the man and his style of writing, because his depictions of good and bad, heroes and villains, they always struck me. Nowhere in life do we find the clear distinction between positive and negative, good and bad, the black and white. And we rarely see those contrasts highlighted against a philosophy, if you will, a philosophical background, as well as Louis did, I think. Louis spoke of ancient history. He spoke of cultures. He spoke of philosophers. And he did that in the context of the hero thinking about and within himself in a first-person context. He would often write first person, which I love, and he would often write first person in a philosophical context. So the hero was thinking about and to himself, examining his life. And of course, the examined life is what we should all be about. So I never really found that in other books as much as I would like. And I also like, of course, the blood and thunder. Everybody wants to hear the cowboy stories and the gunfights and all the things that are going on. But I still enjoy reading Louis L'Amour books, even though in many ways, many of his stories are so similar that you have to kind of be ready for that. But his best stories bring out the best in me. They make me think more, and they create in me a desire to be something more myself. I think his best book is Education of a Wandering Man, which is not fiction. It's his autobiography, finished just before his death, because it gives an insight into the man behind the other great books. I love The Daybreakers. It was my first real introduction to Louis L'Amour. And in many website examinations of top 10 Western books of all time, The Daybreakers is often listed as one of the greatest. I think it's a fantastic book. I loved it and still do. Love many, if not all, the Sackett novels. Bendigo Shafter is also one of my favorite books. So I became enthralled with that whole concept of the first person telling it as if he were there in the moment, talking about the challenges and the philosophical context of developing oneself to be better. And I would often tuck myself in at night reading something of Louis, and then I would go to bed and I would try to go to sleep thinking about what it would be like to be a cowboy. To me, it was better than counting sheep. And of course, Yes, I wanted to be a cowboy when I was a kid, and maybe I still do. Now, I was fortunate to grow up in a family of storytellers. And in truth, I think we all grow up in storytelling families if we want to take the time to ask questions and listen carefully and pay attention. People like to talk about themselves, and they like to tell stories if they think they're being listened to. And in my experience, I had some great storytellers in my family. I think we all have that in our families if we listen, and we can learn a lot about ourselves and the lives of our immediate relatives if we can develop that appreciation. Ideally the earlier the better, because often, at least in my experience, by the time I developed the true appreciation for this type of thing, many of those relatives were already gone. So those storytellers helped to bring some of the things that happened in their lives to life for me. So far, I haven't found anyone who didn't have some sort of interesting personal story if they would only open up and if I will only pay attention. So my folks had interesting things to say and interesting stories to tell. And of course, I always loved to hear about the trouble they got into as kids. So that was always fun for me. And they had interesting sayings. Growing up in Appalachia, so many of the sayings were derived from ancient, who knows where, from back in Europe. So it was a fascinating time, and still is a fascinating time to me. I still love to hear the dialect of the southern Appalachian region, although I can't really replicate it myself now because it sounds too fake for me. So the sayings that they had, what a treasure, and I still find those fascinating. Finally, one of the things that helped develop my historical perspective was having a great history teacher when I was in high school. He shared stories, he helped us bring things to life, and others with whom I've spoken have not been so fortunate. So I always am thankful that I had a fellow named Mr. Norton. I won't go into his first name, but Mr. Norton in my history classes whenever I was in high school, he helped us focus on understanding relationships and connections. Wasn't as focused on the dates. We dealt with dates, obviously, but the dates were not paramount. It was about how things were connected. And I've always loved that approach because if you focus on the dates, you lose the story. And if you focus on the story, it's easier to keep the context because you know what happened in which sequence. So it's much easier to reach a young person when you are talking about the story and the context, and you keep their interest. And by osmosis, almost, they learn more about the dates. So luckily, I developed the love for most of my things history whenever I was younger, and I kind of accentuated that in high school with Mr. Norton. After that, I went into the U.S. Air Force as an intelligence analyst. I knew after high school that I was not going to be a college student. I was not prepared for it. I did not have in my mind an idea of what I wanted to do. So why go to college and spend that time and money and not do well, as some of my friends in high school did. They did not succeed, and they left college and maybe didn't go back at all. They didn't go back for quite some time. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. How could I? At 18 years old, I just had not been exposed to anything. My career ambitions at the time I finished high school was to not go to school again. So when you hear what I did next, you're probably going to laugh. But I went into the U.S. Air Force, and of course, what is the first thing that the Air Force does? They send you to schools, all kinds of schools. And so I failed immediately at my career ambition. But I learned a lot. I met my wife there. I was an intelligence analyst in the Air Force, and I met my wife. We had a couple of kids. I started back to community college there, but decided that I was ready to get out of the military. I didn't enjoy the lifestyle, and because of a reduction in force, both of us voluntarily left the Air Force, and I ended up driving a truck for a living. Now there are a few intelligence analyst jobs in the civilian world, so I wasn't going to get a job in that industry, and it's very dependent on government contracts, so I didn't want to have that dependency in the back of my mind. So my wife and I, we settled back here in East Tennessee, and I went back to school. After I drove the truck for a while, I became involved in managing the trucking company to some degree, and I wanted to go back to school to be more educated and to make myself a more well-rounded person. A few years of maturation made a big difference for me, and I think they make a difference for everybody. So therefore, my long and arduous journey in education began. I finished my bachelor's degree, and I was accepted to grad school in history. Chose not to do that, but to go to graduate school in management. Did that. Also went to pursue my doctorate in business administration with an emphasis in marketing, and I achieved that. So it was long and arduous while I was working to go back and attain all those degrees. Ultimately, I worked for several years as a college professor, and I ended my academic career as the dean of the College of Business at a small university here locally. For me, that was enough. I didn't need any more higher education, and I could tell you some stories, but that would be for a whole different type of podcast. So there I am, in a nutshell, a very quick rendition of who is telling you these stories. I'm here strictly not as a historian, because frankly, often I don't like the perspectives of historians. I'm here as an amateur historian who loves history and wants to talk about how things connect and work together. But if we get back to our topic about the myth of the American cowboy, and don't worry, I haven't forgotten about that, I want to look at what I think is the beginning of that. Because before there was a United States, before there was the concept of an America, but before the word cowboy would have ever been uttered, before recorded history, mankind moved around from place to place, nomadic tribes. And if you've ever watched any of those TV shows that are survivor type shows, like my favorite, Alone, where individuals are placed out into the wilderness by themselves, and the objective is to see who can last the longest. I always thought that was a fantastic show, because it truly shows how difficult it is for a person to live on his or her own out in the middle of the wilderness. It's a full-time job to keep yourself clothed and warm and fed. And one person doing that alone is a very difficult process. So mankind for eons moved around from place to place in nomadic tribes, chasing the food, trying to find enough food to keep themselves alive. Now, obviously, it was very difficult to find more than enough food to sustain yourself and your family. And food sources were not terribly reliable. As long as those tribes moved around chasing the food for the most part, there was no need or even a possibility of having management of livestock. But later, whenever those tribes started to domesticate animals, then food became a little more secure, more predictable. So in order to kind of go back to the beginning of the cowboy, we have to think about the advent of the shepherd, the sheep herder. And that began to change when animals were domesticated, starting with the first domesticated animal, which was probably the dog, somewhere between 13,000 and 34,000 BC. Somewhere in Eurasia, the first dogs were domesticated as companions, as guards, as animals that could be used for beasts of burden. They became pets in a way, but they also became a partner to mankind. From there, other animals that were later domesticated would have been sheep, goats, cats, pigs, and the cow. All those were domesticated somewhere between about 7,000 to 9,000 years ago BC. In the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, China, the Indus Valley, the Eastern Sahara, those were the areas where these animals would have been domesticated. The chicken was domesticated in Southeast Asia in about 6,000 BC, and the horse about 3,500 BC in Central Asia. So you can see that it took a while for the need for herds to be managed to actually begin to occur. As mankind started to develop villages and towns and cities, the needs of the animals changed. When you're living in small tribal units, the animals are food. They are supplying supplies like leather and bone and things like that for tools. And they were raised for their fleece and for their hides and those types of things. But as mankind moved into villages, not every person in the village could have access to their own flock. They lived and worked in the village, and the village had people who specialized in various things, just as the farmers and who raised food and cattle and pigs and chickens and everything else would have lived outside of the town, outside of the village. they developed, if they were smart, if they were good managers, they developed their systems so that they had a surplus of food which could be bartered with those city dwellers. And the city dwellers could in turn provide something of value for the farmers, and this barter system allowed valuable resources to be traded back and forth between groups of people and even between cultures. We all have heard of the Silk Road, and the Silk Road was just a result of these trading patterns of barter going back and forth across and through multiple cultures. And we would even know that Columbus was seeking a shorter trade route to the Far East in 1492 when he stumbled upon the Caribbean islands in what we call discovering America. As those herds grew larger, someone had to protect them from predators. These sheep herders or shepherds watched the herd closely. They looked after them. They made sure of their general welfare. And we could say that the first real cowboys were the shepherds of long ago and those first civilizations in the Fertile Crescent. So when we think about the cowboy, we want to think about the relationships to those ancient shepherds. In order to have cowboys, you have to have cattle. And the first cattle to land in the Americas came from Spain. They were brought by the conquistadors to help provide a stable food source for their invading armies of fortune seekers and empire builders. And these cattle were small, rangy Andalusian cattle that were popular at that time in Spain. They didn't look like very much, but they were really tough. They had that quality of toughness. The first animals to reach the North American continent proper would have landed in Veracruz, Mexico in 1521, 6 heifers and a young bull. They were transported from Santo Domingo Island by Gregorio de Villalobos, and these cattle were part of the fabric of the daily lives of those explorers, men like Cortez or Pizarro or De Soto, Ponce de Leon when he was exploring Florida, Narvaez, Coronado, many others. They enabled these men and the armies that they controlled to move freely across South, Central, and North America in search of the gold, the silver, and the slaves that they hope, or should I say expected to find. When Coronado traveled into the American Southwest searching for the 7 cities of Cibola, he brought goats and hogs and sheep and 500 or more cattle. And the Spanish at that time didn't castrate their bull calves, so most of the stock in the New World would have been breeding stock. Along the way, there were cattle that were injured or exhausted, and Coronado left those in Sinaloa. 25 years later, Francisco de Ibarra found cattle running by the thousands in that area, according to J. Frank Dobie. The first use of the term, or the word, cowboy in the English language was 1725, a direct translation from the Spanish word vaquero, which means one who manages cattle from horseback. Now, vaquero comes from vaca for cow and originates from the Latin vacarius, which means cow herd, vaca, and agent or dealer, arius. Some synonyms include cow herd, cow hand, rancher, stockman, cowman, buckaroo, cow puncher, cow poke, and many others. The cowboy, and just to show that the job remains the same regardless of the name, arose by any other name after all. Some terms from other cultures that refer to a cowboy would be drover or stockman in Australia. Of course, vaqueros, as we talked about, from Mexico. Charros is another. In Argentina, southern Chile, or Uruguay, gauchos would be used. Southern Chile, also huasos. Venezuela, llaneros. Peru, chalan. And Italy, buteri. So lots of different words referred to the cowboy. Now later, the first lodging house we would call hotels today, but at that time they called it a lodging house in Abilene, Kansas. It was called the drover's cottage, drover being one of the popular words used to describe the cowhands. This establishment was dedicated to the men who rode the cattle trails north and the buyers who were the market for the cows. And the drover's cottage filled the need and is legendary. All kinds of stories talk about the drover's cottage. Texans, of course, was another popular name for those who drove those Texas cattle to market, for the simple reason that most of those herds came directly from southern Texas. So it was an easy thing, and it was the association that most people had. Now, we can think about examples of cattle herds and ranches and cattle drives prior to the American Civil War. It goes back before the classic American Western period. And this helps to demonstrate the increasing importance of cattle and the men who controlled those herds. The Republic of Texas was settled by the Spanish, and they established missions there in the late 1600s to try to fend off settlement by other empires. They also wanted to develop the mines that they had started there. However, these attempts to settle the Southwest met strong resistance by the Apache and the Comanche and other tribes. The resistance resulted in terrible losses for the Spanish. Between 1771 and 1776, in that 5-year span, in the province of Nueva Vizcaya, Apaches killed 1,674 people, took 154 captives, seized more than 66,000 head of cattle, and forced the abandonment of more than 100 ranches and haciendas. Now, Louis L'Amour writes of this in his novel, The Lonely Men, when Tel Sackett and his friends are trying to escape from Apaches who are pursuing them northward. As they're riding north through the countryside, they find an abandoned ranch. And these are Louis's words. The ranch was deserted, a ruin. Fire had gutted it, and some of the stone walls had toppled. The windows gaped like great hollow eyes that stared upon nothing. The barns were a tumbled mass of burned timbers and the fallen stones of foundation walls. Mesquite trees choked up the corrals. Once this ranch had been a splendid place. Once the fields had been green and men had worked here, lived here, and loved here. The place had a good field of fire in every direction and must have been easy to defend back in the old days. Yet the Indians had taken it, they'd burned it out, and more than likely killed everybody on the ranch. The Lonely Men, 1969, Louis L'Amour. And just as Louis said, people had lived and worked and loved here. Those 66,000 head of cattle were being cared for by some number of vaqueros, cowboys. And this is only one province in northern Mexico. The number of cattle and horses which were stolen or escaped or released at that point in time, the late 1500s, the mid to late 1600s, is incalculable. Much of what we would come to associate with the cowboy, however, existed well before the mid to late 1800s. The cattle that would evolve into the longhorns of the West, along with the Spanish Mustangs, which would develop right alongside them, well, they were domesticated and managed by the Moors and the Spanish. The techniques they used to manage both were introduced to the American colonies through the Spanish in Louisiana. Simultaneously, techniques in the eastern colonies were being developed and used regularly to move cattle and care for them. Cattle were often grazed on public lands, and they were gathered regularly at roundups. Now, those roundups included the frenzied celebrations that we saw and still see at this point whenever rodeos are celebrated, because those roundups often turned into a spectacle. Those cattle hunters in the American East regularly drove cattle into established cow pens to be sorted according to brand so that ownership could be established. The same thing happened in the western cattle drives. Cowpen, South Carolina, the site of a famous Revolutionary War battle, was named for just such a location. And even Theodore Roosevelt recognized the lineage of the cowboy when he wrote the very term roundup is used by the cowboys in the exact sense in which it is employed by the hill people and mountaineers of Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Now, during the American Revolution, the term cowboy was used as an insult, referring to those who were the ardent, loyalist supporters of King George III. These men rang cowbells from the brush to lure patriots who were looking for lost cows. According to Marie Sandoz, the word cowboy was a fighting word, unless you said it with a smile. But I suppose there are lots of words that could be that, come to think of it. Now, by the 1870s, Charles Goodnight, who had called his hands boys for much of his working life, was calling the men who worked the 100,000 cattle on the J.A. Ranch cowboys. But if this is the backstory of the cowboy, if this is how things began, what happened that led to the glamorized image that developed? How did the cowboy become the American hero he became? And how much of the real story of that cowboy is included in the idealized image that we have today? The typical cowboy we visualize may differ slightly from person to person, but I'd say will likely contain several characteristics in common. We might think of them as loners, independent, tough, honest, possessing homespun wisdom. But this is an interesting part of the story to me, because the Western men who became legendary often had some of those elements of notoriety in their own lifetimes. They were talked about. They were written about in their own lifetimes. After all, they were doing interesting things. They lived what appeared to the folks who lived comfortably in civilization back east, a wild and exciting life. Of course, this wild and exciting life was reported in glowing terms by the newspaper writers of the day. They were trying to sell newspapers. And if we toss in the dime novels, the pulp fiction written by writers like Edward Zane Carroll Judson, known by his nom de plume of Ned Buntline, it's easy to see that the dramatized life of these men was something worth reading about. Everyone who picked up a copy could live vicariously for a little while. Just like I talked about earlier, my living vicariously the life of a cowboy by reading Louis L'Amour's Westerns. I suspect much like children who watch Star Wars can dream of being Luke Skywalker or Princess Leia. But those dramatizations were just that. Those pulp fiction novels, those dime novels, they were just that. They were dramatizations. They were more fancy than they were fact. In fact, Kit Carson, who was legendary in his own time, was fictionalized in Charles Avrill's Kit Carson, The Prince of the Gold Hunters in 1848, when Carson was 40 years old. Now this was perhaps, I've seen references that this was the first pulp fiction novel, and one that attributed truly legendary exploits to Carson. There are so many that's hard to even summarize any of them, but one example is one of the facts that were supposedly reported in the novel, that Carson discovered the Californian gold fields. Ultimately, 70 different books were written about Kit Carson, but in reality, they only used Carson's soaring popularity to sell the books that were purely fictional. And Carson didn't like it and never earned a cent from those books. In fact, it was so bad that in 1856, Kit Carson decided that he would try to control some of that exaggeration. He tried to dictate a memoir of his life to Dr. DeWitt Peters. And as the way with Kit Carson, the story was understated and it was factual. Kit Carson didn't talk a lot and he was very soft-spoken. Carson was noted for speaking in monosyllables, so it's not likely that he was going to be too verbose in describing what he had done. The book was published in 1859, and it was entitled The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson, the Nestor of the Rocky Mountains, from facts narrated by himself. I always love those titles of those older books because they go on forever. But when Carson finally had the book read to him, because he was illiterate, his only comment was, "Peters laid it on a little thick." Now it's easy to see why Kit Carson, who had genuine heroic exploits, and the cowboys of a generation later were fictionalized as they were. There were many things they were doing which were heroic, they were exciting, they were terribly unusual to people back east. But the real life of a cowboy was a lot less saloon and dance hall girls and gambling and gunfights, and a lot more about riding drag on a dusty herd, sleeping only a few hours at night, eating a bland and sometimes simply terrible diet. But then, as Maxwell Scott said in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, "This is the West, sir, and when the legend becomes fact, print the legend." After the Civil War, the romanticism associated with the American West became more pronounced, and it was helped along by the promotion of the Western U.S. by those who hoped to gain from westward expansion. Newspapers and pulp fiction, we talked about Buntline earlier, helped to popularize people like Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, Wild Bill Hickok. And they were fictionalized and popularized far beyond the scope of their actual exploits, as we already talked about. This grew over time, and a fellow named Joe France, who wrote a book we'll talk about shortly, referred to this time frame as the heroic age in America. The frontier expansion area took center stage at that point. I just mentioned a book by Joe France. In 1955, France took a look at the American cowboy with his book, The American Cowboy, The Myth and the Reality. And in his own words, he said, "The cowboy story, as every television viewer of 3 years knows by instinct, if not by research, begins in Texas, builds to its peak in Texas, and then diffuses throughout the entire West until almost every trans-Mississippi state contributes its share of threads to the whole tapestry. With high seriousness and yet with the most genial intentions, we shall attempt to dissect the cowboy, realizing, of course, that he is apparently an eternal character who will not be fenced in, but will, instead, continue to go tearing across the open range, his horse's hoofs kicking up a dust fog of legend that no amount of deadening analysis can ever settle. The West lives on, and this book intends to do nothing to kill it off, no matter how inaccurately remembered and portrayed it may turn out to be. Now, France allowed that the American cowboy really existed at three distinct levels in thought in the minds of most modern Americans. Arguably, these planes might have changed dramatically, just as America has changed dramatically in the 70 years since the publication of the book. The three planes he believed the cowboy to occupy were, number one, historical, meaning the average person really doesn't know much about it and cares less. In my former life as a college professor, I was often astounded by just the profound ignorance of history and, among many other things, shown by many of my students. Ignorance, not stupidity. I attribute this ignorance partly to the horrendous state of K-12 education in the United States, and partly to popular culture, which, it seems, places no value whatsoever in the historical. So we're talking about the planes, the three planes of France here. Number one, historical. Number two, fictional. A popular place in the minds of most people. They enjoy reading the stories, watching the movies, those types of things. But the third plane is folklore, the ideal created by the dramatization of the lifestyle. There's a lot to consider in France's book, and I like this quote, which is actually part of the foreword. The cowboy has carved a definite niche nothing. It's a great gorge in American affection as a folk hero of substance and endurance. Now, we could characterize the American cowboy as possessing many qualities that we associate with the American character. Things like strength and honesty, acquisitiveness, inquisitiveness, self-sufficiency, energy, optimism, constant hope of better things to come. All of those we might attribute to the American cowboy. I like France's thoughts on the relationship between reality and yarn, though, because when you apply those to the American cowboy mythology, we kind of have a better understanding of what we're looking at. Remember that this was written in 1955, so this was the heyday, if you will, of the American Western on television and in movies, as well as in popular novels. In France's words, a discrepancy exists between the range cowboy as he has been represented fictionally and as he actually was. A folk hero he has become, with no present evidence that his unique position is on the wane. If for every truth that is told about the cowboy each year in poem, novel, and ballad, and let us state right here that to us truth need not be strictly actual if it will just capture the essence. Well, there's a matching untruth, exaggeration, or caricature. If for every good story that emerges concerning the cowboy, there are concomitant inanities, and if the cowboy operating on a vast canvas spotted with dramatic possibilities has largely been missed by the writers of great literature, are these things the fault of the cowboy, or do they lie with the limited vision of those people who approach the cowboy's story? Let us see. Joe France, 1955. So we come to the point where we need to compare. We need to make that comparison between the real and the mythical. Remember that the enormity of the American West was not something that any of those who made their lives there at that time could truly comprehend. The immensity of that broad swath of land across the middle of North America was really only imaginable if we have the perspective of modern mapping, things like Google Maps and Google Earth, car trips, and especially an airplane trip if you're flying over 30,000, 40,000 feet. But the fact is, the Great Plains comprise about 1.3 million square miles of territory, 44% of the landmass of the United States. So almost half of the United States landmass taken up by the Great Plains. Now, my wife and I recently took a trip west from our home here in Tennessee, and we visited the resting place of the great Jim Bridger in Independence, Missouri. We actually also stopped by the embarkation point, the place where those trains, wagon trains, would have outfitted, and from there started west. We then went on up to St. Joseph, Missouri, and we stopped by the Pony Express stables up there in St. Joseph. And if you can imagine my excitement visiting those places that I'd read about, and I thought about the events, the history that had taken place there, and what I had read about since I was a kid. It was a beautiful time for me. From there, we traveled along the Platte River through Nebraska and Wyoming. We followed those western trails, stopping off at places like Ogallala and Windlass Hill and Fort Laramie, the Guernsey Ruts, Independence Rock, South Pass City, and Fort Bridger in Wyoming. Fort Bridger was a highlight for me simply because I had read so much about it in so many places as a younger person. And so stopping there and getting a chance to take a look around and actually be in the places that I'd read about was fascinating to me. From there, we ended up traveling on into Utah, and we diverted a bit. We got up around Bear Lake, which is a beautiful spot. Dropped down into the farming area of Utah and went over to Promontory Point, where the Golden Spike was driven. Then up through Idaho and on through Oregon, along the Columbia River Gorge to Cape Disappointment, the winter camp of Lewis and Clark in that winter of 1805-1806. So it took us about 9 days to reach Cape Disappointment. And although we stopped a few times to see some friends and to see sights, still, 9 days to get there. It was quite a trip, and I was amazed at the difficult terrain. I was amazed at the river crossings and simply the immensity of it all. The sheer scope of trying to make a trip from anywhere in the east to that promised land of the Willamette Valley in Oregon, 2,100 plus miles, from my perspective today would be staggering. And I wonder how many of those people who traveled west in the days of that Oregon Trail, 1840s, 1850s, would have been eager to do that had they realized what they faced prior to that adventure. I think sometimes ignorance is the best preparation for that big thing that you want to accomplish. And I've heard many people say this, if you knew how difficult it would be, well, you probably wouldn't embark on that. As an aside, one of the things I do want to say is that if you get a chance to go to Oregon and take a ride down the Columbia River Gorge, by all means do so. Oregon's a beautiful state. We had a wonderful trip, and it was a beautiful ride for us, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Now, if you think about this, at the time that the westward expansion was taking place, the American government wanted those settlers to move west. Manifest destiny was the cry. There was an intent to own the territory by virtue of the fact that you possess it. More people are there. You can't get rid of those people. You can't drive them out. And so it's more likely that the United States is going to be able to take over the entire area, and then ultimately to settle that entire area and make that land worth something. You know, Horace Greeley wrote, "Go west, young man." And if we're honest, the hyperbole that surrounded people like Kit Carson at that time was also applied to the territories. There were many writers who were trying to make some money from offering books and papers on the land and the trip to the west. In fact, there's a great story about the Donner Party and how they believed that there was a shortcut in northeastern Utah through the mountains that would help them get to California faster, but it didn't work out that way. But they believed a book that they had read, and I'll get into that in a future podcast. So the speculators in the American government wanted settlers to move west. And I want to do a podcast in the future just about the promotion, the advertising, the selling of the American West, publications, newspaper stories, and flyers, all the things that created the drive westward by a lot of people, because there was such a focus on promoting what was often, as I said, hyperbole. It wasn't really factual. It was what the speculators wanted people to believe. Land speculators, and later the railroads themselves, which were granted millions of acres of land along their right-of-way to assist in the building of the railroads. They wanted to sell that land to settlers, encouraging them to move west. And there's a lot of mythology there as well. The book Bendigo Shafter that I spoke about a while ago has actually a short blurb in there. When Shafter's taking a trip back west on the train is going through a blizzard, stops off at a small town, just a few shacks, and is going to grab some wood to help with the firebox to keep the fires going on the train. But the settlers that are there won't let them have any wood because they need it to burn for themselves, and they want to stay there because they bought these plots of land along the railroad tracks. Lamore reveals through Bendigo's, or through the conductor's eyes, the conductor comes back and says it's a shame that these people think they're going to have any land that's worth anything because the railroad is going to be straightened and we're going to be, a few miles away now, and this land won't be worth very much at all. So you can see that the speculation was a very real thing. Now, the real life, as I said before, of the cowboy and those who were going west had a lot less to do with gunfights, saloons, dance hall girls, than with the really tough times, riding drag, eating dust, long nights, violent electrical storms. Teddy Blue Abbott talks about lightning dancing off the horns of the longhorns while he was riding night herd. It is a very scary thing to think about that. And they ate a lot of plain, sometimes just plain bad food. So the realities were a stark contrast with the fictionalized version of what those cowboys were doing. But the men who were the cowboys loved the life. In his book, France provided some insight into that myth versus reality relationship of the American cowboy when he said, "The cowboy went incidentally about being frontiersman and pathfinder for an empire, while fundamentally he thought trying to bring resource and market together. He trailed for a maximum of 30 years, and most of his trailing was done between 1870 and 1885, so a generation only. But in that time, he and 40,000 other cowboys headed out somewhere with their herds. These were bold men, they're courageous men, aware that danger was real and that over the next swell of prairie might wait the untamed Comanche, or that a sound might send the herd stampeding death in every hoof, so that not every companion who rode away that morning was guaranteed safe passage till the next morning." The year in which my paternal grandmother was born, 1892, was the end of that open range, and what we would call the cattle drive, because barbed wire was introduced and the railroads moved farther along and had spur lines that were closer to the cattle grounds anyway. So if we look at the real versus the mythology, we see that things start to settle down so that some of the activities that were required by cowboys were less so by the late 1800s, the early 1900s. Fred Gibson, the author of Old Yeller, Savage Sam, and other works of fiction which have added so much from Texas culture to the fictional story, talked about what a typical cowboy might look like when he gave a description of Fat Alfred, a cowboy he knew well. So here's Gibson's description. "He's a far cry from being a typical cowhand. He's never shot a man in his life. He never chased a rustler across the Rio Grande. He never rescued a beautiful girl from ruthless bandits and rode off into the sunset with his arm about her waist. But he can rope a cow out of a brush patch so thick that a Hollywood cowboy couldn't crawl into it on his hands and knees. He can break a horse for riding, doctor wormy sheep, make a balky gasoline engine pump water for thirsty cattle, tail up a winter poor cow, or punch a string of post holes across a rocky ridge. He can make out with patched gear, sorry mounts, and skimpy grub, and still get the job done. He can do it in freezing weather or under a sun hot enough to raise blisters on a boot hill. And all the time, under any circumstances, he works with the thorough understanding that it's the livestock that counts, not the cowhand. On top of all this, he's got a quality common to most working cowhands, a way of meeting life head-on, with a recklessness and a wildness of spirit, and a real relish for conquering it. He goes after life as if it were something that had to be roped in a hurry before it got away. And whether he catches it or not, it's a good chase, worth the try, and will make an entertaining yarn." France also gave a description of the early cowboy. The dyed-in-the-wool early cowboy was a Texan who had been reared on the open ranges, seemingly isolated from everything but horses and cattle. He knew the habits and customs of range cattle better than most men ever comprehend the habits of their wives. He had always lived on the frontier, and though he might collide with civilization occasionally, he always seemed a little surprised to discover its existence. He imposed his speech or lingo, his dress, his actions, and his outlook on the whole range country, and his influence is still vitally alive in American folk life. Only technological advance improved his methods of handling cattle. His patience, ingenuity, faithfulness, loyalty, and alternating taciturnity and garrulity are legends. I've read some different things about different cowboys, and not all were from Texas originally, and in fact, many were not. Many would have been raised back east in one form or another, in one place or another, and they would have migrated there. When we examine the daily life of a cowboy, we find that there was very little of the excitement we see on stage and screen. And if we look at it truthfully, it was brutally hard work. Long days, longer nights, dust, dirt, hunger, thirst, bone-wearying work. I mean, riding all day, probably not eating enough, a lot of hardships of various sorts. River crossings were crazy. They were ridiculously difficult. All of that for somewhere between $25 and $40 per month. But at this point, the folks back east were making somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 per day on average, or about $60 a month, while not having to face many of those hardships. So we can see that the cowboy did not embark on his career to be independently wealthy or financially secure. The typical cowboy probably did it, either because he had few other options, or he loved the nature of the work, or probably both. Now, most men didn't cowboy all their lives. They worked for a few months, a few years, a few drives, and they went about their lives working in or at other professions, because being a cowboy is really a young man's game. And those who aged out or got hurt, they couldn't actively be involved in this game any longer. One of the questions I asked myself when I started putting this together was, is there such a thing as a stereotypical cowboy, the Marlboro Man concept? And the answer to that is, in our mind perhaps, but in reality, cowboys were really diverse. All who wanted that type of lifestyle likely wanted some sort of freedom. Myself, I can only speak for me, but for myself, I have never liked thinking that I have someone looking over my shoulder. I've never liked being told what I have to do. I've always been a bit of a rebel in that regard, and I think most of us want some kind of freedom. So I think everybody who wanted to be a cowboy, and everybody who still might romanticize about that, perceives that as being a huge part of the lifestyle, the freedom. Nobody would have wanted that freedom more than the portion of cowboys who were former slaves or freedmen. Now, some estimates say that somewhere around 25% or more of all cowboys were black. And we could say that the American West was the foremost opportunity for those that were interested in meritocracy. If you were judged based upon your work and your reputation by those who knew you, then your color of your skin mattered less. I'm not going to say it didn't matter at all, because certainly it did. You were judged based upon your work and your reputation, your background, your past, your name. All those things were left behind in search of that new future. The color of your skin mattered less than your ability to accomplish what was asked of you. It still mattered. We'll talk about that in the future podcast, perhaps. But competency dictated worth in the eyes of others. And there was probably nothing that was looked down on more than someone who was incompetent. There are lots of examples of black cowboys and Western characters, and there are certainly many others who are unknown, but perhaps just as accomplished out there. I'll try to discuss those a lot further in another podcast, but a short list of notable blacks in the West would start with James Beckwourth, who was a noted trapper and compatriot of Jim Bridger. And it would include Ism Dart and Nat Love, Bose Eichard, Daniel Webster, A.D. John Wallace, and lots of others. In fact, I talked about Independence, Missouri earlier, and one of the foremost outfitters, I think building wagons and had a harness shop and things like that, was a black man who was very successful there. More to come on this in the future. So if we look at the evolution of the cowboy, the frontier moved further and further west beyond the eastern mountains and into the Midwest, the Great Plains, the Pacific Coast regions. Moving and maintaining herds of animals became much more important. The wealth and the welfare of the pioneers who were moving westward could all easily be encompassed by the herds of horses, mules, cattle, and oxen. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the U.S.-Mexican War on May 30th, 1848. So the war to secure Texas was over. And although the war ended, the movement of Americans to that newly acquired territory had really just begun. It was during that time that Charles Goodnight moved with his family to Texas. And Charles Goodnight, commonly called the father of the Cowboys. And when it comes to figures of the West who are legendary based upon their exploits, Goodnight has to be at the top of that list. From this vantage point here, my comfortable office in the 21st century, Goodnight's exploits read like a novel. They don't have to be fictionalized to make them seem larger than life. And sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. To me, it's more interesting. If you think about Goodnight, he was called Charlie by his family. Born in 1836 in Illinois, they moved to Texas in 1846 when he was 10 years old. In 1857, Goodnight and his stepbrother contracted to manage 400 cows. And by managing those cows, they were going to do things like keeping them bunched up so they didn't drift, keeping them watered, making sure that if they had any births that things were taken care of, and just overall watching for the wellness of the herd. In return for that work, those two young men were supposed to receive 1/4 of the calves that were born. Goodnight later said that after 1 year of work, their share was 32 calves. Now remember that each calf was valued at about $3. So 1 year of solid work amounted to $96, not counting expenses, is what Goodnight said. $96 split between those two young men. Most cowboys didn't own their own cattle either. They were handling the cattle that were owned by other people, other drovers, other ranchers, and often raised by the ranchers or rounded up by the ranchers and handed off to the drovers to take north. These cowboys were hired hands, that they didn't own the land, they didn't own the stock. They were an ad hoc group brought on to handle a specific situation, either calving or branding, or the cattle drive. And they were cut loose as soon as that need ended. So they were going to be paid at the northern terminus, if it was Abilene or if it was Dodge City or wherever. And they were going to be paid off at that point, and they were going to figure out how to get back to where they needed to be or to drift to another place where they wanted to be. This was a time for independent people. This was a time and a place for people who worked to earn enough money to move along or build something of their own. You weren't going to get rich working as a hired hand in Texas, and maybe not even as a rancher in Texas, but you could drive those cattle to other markets where the prices were better. You could drive your herds to Galveston or New Orleans, the closest places where those cattle could be shipped to the northern markets via boat. Steer prices in those markets was about $3 per head, so if you didn't encounter any problems and had good fortune to get your herd in at the right time, you were going to get about $3 per head. If you drove them to other markets, Shreveport of Vidalia, and also in the 1849-50 gold rush in California, large markets were opened up in the California region. But you had to cross the desert, you had to deal with Apaches and Comanches, and if they didn't end your drive prematurely, you could realize a more profitable outcome. One herd was even driven to Illinois, where it wintered, and then moved on to Muncie, Indiana, and then they put it on a train to go to New York, where they received somewhere around $80 per head for a few of those cattle. I want to tell this story in a future episode about the ranchers and drovers and speculators who built and lost massive empires during the mid and late 1800s. These same cattle could have driven to the gold fields of California, and I talked about that earlier. They did bring, at least at one point, $160 a head. By the end of the Civil War, cattle prices in Texas were about $4 per head. And those cattle drives to railheads in Missouri became common because there were lots of rumors of $40 cattle prices that came down to the Texas drovers. All they needed was a way to get the actual commodity to market. And that's where the trail drives came in. Lots of reasons existed. The big one was profit, obviously. Lots of cattle available for little or no cost in Texas. Millions of cattle roaming free. A gateway to the northern and eastern markets opened up. So you move those cattle across the rivers, you drive them into southwest Missouri, and you sell them. You put them on a train, or you drive them on up into Illinois, and you put them on a train there. These drives had been going on for years. Prior to and during the Civil War, they were still taking place. But after the Civil War, the impetus really picked up. There was a tremendous impact on Texas during the Civil War because cattle had remained essentially untouched there for a long 4 years. Not very many cattle had been taken out and driven north. After the Civil War, somewhere between 5 and 6 million feral cattle roamed the state of Texas, according to J. Frank Dobie. Now, there's lots of reasons why Texas was the place where southern Texas would have been the place where cattle would have been able to grow wild and feral and quickly. The mesquite thickets helped protect them. Again, remember, those cattle were small, they were rangy, they were more like wild animals, and we will do a podcast on the longhorns themselves and the characteristics of the longhorns. But there were also wild horses roaming in the same areas. Somewhere around 2 million horses were roaming in the Southwest during the same time. So these horses and cattle did not have significant pressure. No significant threats from predators existed for them. Their populations grew exponentially, and of course their value grew because there were more and more of them, and you could drive large-scale herds northward. So this movement of men, horses, and cattle northward to that railroad access began in earnest sometime in 1866, when more than 250,000 longhorns were moved along the trails out of Texas. Many of those cattle were lost. They were lost to armed mobs of angry farmers who worried about Texas fever, the deadly disease to domesticated cattle in the northern area, which was the result of a tick that moved with the cattle northward from Texas. But even worse, there were hooligans who simply wanted to profit by demanding some sort of fee to allow the herds to pass. So they wanted to cut the herd and take some of the stock for themselves. Or they just wanted to take over the entire herd, and they were going to steal the whole thing. The seeds of the cattle drives, and by necessity the cowboy we think of today, were planted there in 1866, but they sprouted in 1867 when Joseph McCoy, an Illinois businessman who had been involved in the stock business for quite some time, and whom we will discuss in greater detail in a later podcast, he wanted to expand his livestock business. And to do that, he first looked at St. Louis, Missouri, and the Missouri Pacific Railroad. He didn't get anywhere with the president of the Missouri Pacific Railroad and had to go to other partners. He found the Kansas Pacific Railroad, which did agree to transport his cattle from the western towns to Chicago. And so Chicago became the destination for cattle that were being exported via train. We'll talk about this much more in a future podcast, but McCoy had to go find the perfect place to station or position the railhead for those cattle out of Kansas. And Abilene, Kansas turned out to be the place for this cattle market. Abilene was a small town, tiny town, and establishing this cattle market there involved building all the infrastructure they would need. The railhead stopped there in Abilene, but there were just a few shanties that were built there, dugouts, that type of thing. Now, McCoy didn't know it at the time, but that partnership with the Kansas Pacific Railroad, although it shaped the future of the cattle industry in the United States and opened the eastern markets to him, it would also be his undoing. And I'll tell you more about that, well, you know. Joe France says that in Abilene, the Texas cowboy was discovered and first became a distinct type. And here, he first displayed for a national audience those extremes of temperament that make a hero. As I mentioned earlier, history is nothing but one long, unbroken story with threads that tie everything together if we take our time and we try to understand those various connections. And when we think about this, for me, one of the examples is that at the same time that the cattle in Texas were growing in numbers, and as the western markets for stocking herds was growing larger, meaning that there were other ranchers that were starting to move west and other settlers that were beginning to grow cattle or ranch the cattle in the northern territories, Wyoming, Montana, and those areas. As those stocking herd demands grew larger, the changes in society as a result of the Civil War resulted in countless numbers of young men being left without much of a livelihood, and I would suppose seemingly without a purpose. I remember hearing very early in life that idle hands are the devil's workshop and idle lips are his mouthpiece. And I certainly think this is true. Economies have been destroyed by the war. Property rights were often in limbo because the rights of the individuals who had fought with the Confederacy, well, they were still being debated. Questions like, should they be allowed to own land? Should they be allowed to vote? Should they be required to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States government? How should they be punished? Should they be punished? All these questions and lots of others were being openly debated. And there was no easy answer for any of those questions. So for some from the South, their property was now in the hands of someone else, and it was going to be that way, at least for some unforeseen amount of time. For everybody, the reality of what they experienced every day changed significantly, especially for those from the South, and the world was upside down to them. This probably shows how much of a nerd I am, but I've often spent a lot of time wondering what I would have done were I alive and of fighting age in 1861, 1862 time frame. I don't think it's possible to know, but I can tell you that my great-great-grandfather spent most of the war living simply with his family in the Appalachian Mountains. Like most people he would have known, he was a subsistence farmer, and he would have wanted to be left alone by the government. It didn't matter which government, as long as he was left alone. Didn't own slaves, was never going to own slaves, didn't have any idea about the major political components associated with that. But in late 1864, he joined the Union Army and went into camp in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I think it very likely that he had never been that far from home in his life. And he didn't last long. He died from typhus in the camp and is buried in a Knoxville cemetery. But we can get back to our story for a moment. Sorry to digress. What are your options when you arrive at a momentous and troubling time in your life that you're questioning your place? Where are you supposed to be? Your whole life has been turned upside down. Your town has been turned upside down. Much of the South was destroyed because of battles or because of just economically it wasn't going to perform anymore. What are you going to do? For many, I think that they were looking for a new direction. They were looking for a new purpose, a new challenge, a change of scenery, and perhaps I would have chosen to explore the new frontier as well. A place where I could leave my old life, regardless of what that life looked like, behind. The promise of something better, or at least something different, beckoned. And for many, the war had tainted how they viewed the Union, their neighbors, and their communities. And so there was always the belief that something better that they hoped to find was also a faster path to riches. Of course, adventurers had always been looking for something better. I mean, mankind is made up of people who yearn for more, opportunity, excitement, the unknown. What lies beyond the next bend in the river or over the next mountain? Well, we don't know, but we want to know. We want to see. After all, isn't this why the bear went over the mountain? These motivations were at least a part of the movement westward in those post-war years. Which brings us to what I would consider to be the golden age of the American West, the years 1865 to 1890, the cowboy years. Now, this 25-year period encompassed many of the things we consider to be classic Old West in nature. We could take a timeline with all the significant events in American history which occurred during those years, and we'd clearly be able to see the impact of the individuals who lived and worked, fought and died during that time frame. Businesses were started, empires were built, fortunes were won and lost in every industry and in almost every conceivable way. Among those people was Charlie Goodnight, our father of the cowboy whom we discussed earlier. His story is one that will be difficult to believe if not for the documentation. And a very successful rancher in Colorado, the Goodnight Loving Trail obviously opened up a pathway to take cattle from Texas up into southeastern Colorado. And in fact, the Larry McMurtry book, Lonesome Dove, in that series was based upon Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving and the things that they did. And of course, that became a tremendously successful miniseries, which probably introduced many people who had not read the books to Larry McMurtry and those characters. But it's interesting to examine the impact that Charles Goodnight would have had on everything that came later. In fact, I think he's credited with inventing the chuck wagon for use during the cattle drives. More to come from Charles Goodnight in a future podcast. It's here that we need to begin to think about winding down this early examination of the cowboy. As I said, this is not exhaustive. This is me taking a stab at recording my first podcast. and thinking through what I want this podcast to be. I've been in my own mind a bit disjointed, I think, and I want to tie things together here toward the end so that we have something we can build upon in the future. We will tie together all of these various points at which I said I want to have a podcast on one topic or another in the future. We've examined lots of things, some of the reasons why the imagery became larger than life, some of the people, a few. And we looked in detail at Kit Carson, for instance, and how that was so blown out of proportion. I haven't touched on lots of others, and there are many, many others to consider here. Of course, the most famous would be Buffalo Bill Cody, William F. Cody, or Texas Jack Omohundro, whom, to be frank, I hadn't heard about until a few years ago. But Texas Jack Omohundro was truly a cowboy, but he wasn't from Texas, he was from Virginia. Great story for Omohundro. Wild Bill Hickok, who was an Abilene marshal hired by Joseph McCoy in 1871, and his legend grew from there. So there's plenty to talk about, and we will get to all of those stories and the connections that they have with each other and with this podcast as well. I think it's likely that Joe France summed up the writings about the cowboy and the legend that grew from those writings and stories and the mythology that has become part of the collective American identity when he wrote these words. Actually, the American cowboy is the composite, the blood and sinew prototype of all the frontiersmen who inhabited the region of the Great Plains in the latter half of the 19th century. In him are the qualities and characteristics of every frontier folk hero from the Indian fighter of Daniel Boone's day forward. The buffalo hunter, the mountain man, the gold washer, the western immigrant, and the bullwhacker have come in for their share of interest, but not one of them carries much weight as a folk hero. Only the cowboy has captured and held the imagination of the American people, with an interest undiminished by time. The real western cowboy of our imagination was not the exaggerated hero we see and read about. He rarely had gunfights, he seldom visited a town, and he probably rarely won the hand of the prettiest girl in town. He was more likely to be a poor boy, probably a teenager, who was simply looking for some adventure. I mean, after all, aren't we all? And trying to eat and scrape enough money together to have a few dollars left over. He had few other options for making his fortune, such as it was. And if he was willing to suffer deprivation and work hard, he could make enough money to help himself in one way or another. If he was smart, he might save that money and buy some land of his own so that he could start a small farm or ranch. If he was even luckier, he could avoid excessive debt, drought, pestilence, disease, stampedes, rustlers, blizzards, and freezing temperatures, and become successful. Now, certainly this did happen for a few on a large scale. After all, Captain Richard King's King Ranch near Santa Gertrudis Creek in Texas grew to over 600,000 acres by the time of his death in 1885. And Charles Goodnight's J.A. Ranch covered over 1 million acres in the Palo Duro Canyon area of the Texas Panhandle. But many, if not most, of the bigger ranches were owned by stockholders from the East or from someone based in Europe and managed by the local range boss. It was possible to start with little and succeed fantastically. It was also possible to start with little, succeed fantastically, and still fail and wind up with little. Now, King and Goodnight each grew up very poor, and each turned a strong work ethic, intelligence, and guts into successful ranches. Many others made the attempt and failed. And just as today, in the age of Microsoft and Amazon and ChatGPT, we hear about the success stories, but we do not hear about all the failures. That narrative is continually slanted with a success or survivor bias that we can't deny. I want to kind of work toward wrapping this up by mentioning a book that I found just recently, and I'm embarrassed that I only found it recently, but it was a book I highly recommend. It's called We Pointed Them North, Recollections of a Cowpuncher by E.C. Teddy Blue Abbott and Helena Huntington Smith. This is essentially the autobiography of Abbott, covering his time as a cowboy who drove cattle north from Texas to Montana on 4 different occasions. In the introduction to the book, Smith discusses the importance of Abbott's memories when she says, "Well, Teddy Blue is the history of the cattle trail and the open range. The first Texas herds crossed Red River in 1866, and Abilene, Kansas was founded at the end of the Kansas Pacific Railroad in 1867. It would be a few years before McCoy would establish the Drover's Cottage and the livestock shipping trade in Abilene, but the beginnings were already starting to show. Teddy Blue says that most of the Texas cowboys were all Southerners. They were reckless and wild in behavior, and notable for their dress. His exact words, "For dress they wore wide-brimmed beaver hats, black or brown, with low crown, fancy shirts, high-heeled boots, and sometimes a vest. Their clothes and saddles were all homemade." Now these cowboys were mostly medium-sized men. Larger men were too hard on horses, and these cowboys were very good-natured. Teddy Blue made his first trip north with a herd of cattle in 1871 when he and his father went to Texas by way of train to New Orleans and then on by boat to Texas. His father immediately went back to Nebraska after receiving the herd near Red River, so Teddy rode north with the herd and helped wrangle horses. The trail boss for this herd was Sam Bass, the man who would later become a notorious outlaw and who still holds the record for the largest train robbery in the history of the Union Pacific in Big Springs, Nebraska, $60,000. Teddy says that 600,000 head of cattle came up the Texas Trail in 1871, and that seems to align with McCoy's own writings. Lincoln, Nebraska, Teddy's home, was the logical end of the trail for the long drives because the B&M Railroad terminus was there, and the fact that anything farther north was Indian territory and wasn't yet settled with any ranch or farm activity. An interesting point directly from Teddy is that the term cowpuncher became part of the lexicon because at the time of those big cattle shipments back to the settled east, men would need to move along the rail cars prodding cattle with a pole to get them back on their feet, and these men were literally cowpunchers. As I said, Teddy's first drive was in 1871. His father bought cattle and brought them back north. But 1871 was a killing winter for cattle, and there were terrific losses because of that winter. Ultimately, Teddy's father, during his first year as a cattle rancher, lost 196 of his 300 head of cattle, and Teddy ultimately made 3 more cattle drives in 1879, 1881, and 1883. The 1883 drive resulted in his reaching the far northern end of the trail at the Yellowstone River in Montana. Here he stayed until his death in 1939. There's a monument to Edward Charles Teddy Blue Abbott in Musselshell County, Montana, actually in front of the courthouse in Roundup, Montana. And that monument depicts Teddy Blue Abbott crossing the Musselshell River in 1883. Local artist Greg Iseline created the sculpture, and it's wonderfully done, 2 years in the making, dedicated in 2022, July 3rd, 2022, in honor of Teddy Blue Abbott and the work that all those riders and all those cowboys did as they moved those trails north to help settle the Montana Territory. And someday, the next time I take a trip up there, I'm going to go take a look at that. For me, there's nothing better than an autobiography told from a first-person perspective of a time in which I have a deep interest. Teddy's story was all of this for me, and of course there is a little humor. I'll leave you with this. Teddy said there were only 2 things an old-time cowpuncher was afraid of: a decent woman and being set afoot. That wraps up episode 1 of Blood and Leather, the evolution of the myth and the reality of the American cowboy. I've done my best to touch on several different things to just help you think about this. We'll have more to come, and I hope you heard something interesting, that you enjoyed the stories, and I also hope that you will subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and come back to hear episode 2, The Trappers and Mountain Men. I'll see you soon.